Hi, this is Dr. Vahid Aryadoust, and this is the second section of the research methods videos. So I'm going to speak about variables in this video. I'm going to actually use this slideshow. So yeah, all right. There are different types of variables, and the first one is dependent variables. Dependent variables are those that you want to measure, that you are experimenting with. They can also be known as referred to as the outcome of your study, or perhaps the results of your study as well. I'm going to use this laser pointer here. The results of your study. Well, for example, learning grammar. I will provide more examples later as we go ahead in this presentation. So the next type of variable is called independent variables. Independent variables are those that the experimenter manipulates or changes, but they're not necessarily measured, and they have an influence over the dependent variables. Therefore, they're assumed to have a direct impact on dependent variables, such as the effect of peer feedback versus teacher feedback on learning grammar, or something similar like writing skills, which is commonly researched in second language acquisition, or just learning English for academic purposes research. This independent variable has two levels, or has two types: peer feedback level, and teacher feedback level. In addition to these two variables, which are more easily controlled for or measured, we have another group of variables which could have an influence, which could, with the stress over could, have an influence on the results or the dependent variables. They're called extraneous variables. They're not independent variables, and that's why we call them extraneous variables. And therefore, we should identify them and probably should control for them in one way or another. Now, a group of extraneous variables actually do exert a significant impact on the results. They're called confounds. Confounding variables affect the results. So if you have evidence that a group of extraneous variables affected the results of your research, then you should refer to them as confounds. A confound, by definition, is an extraneous variable that was not controlled for but had an influence or an impact on our dependent variable, and they can actually be quite detrimental to the internal validity of your study, and can wreak havoc on the results that you have obtained. Confounding variables, why is it so? Because confounding variables provide an alternative explanation for the findings, an alternative explanation which actually makes a lot of sense as well. I provide examples. Okay, I have chosen this example because in quite a few psychological textbooks and a few presentations I have seen that people presented, and I'm also a fan of this kind of research, although I don't do it, but because obviously my research area is language. I would like to present this, however, because I think this might be something accessible to many people who are watching these videos regarding of the background. So the scenario is that you want to know whether having high fat or high carbs meals can have an influence on people's weight. You assign one group to the high fat diet and another group to the high carbs diet, and then you measure their weights before and after an experiment. Right here, you want to find out what is the dependent variable, independent variable, and other variables that might affect the results. The independent variable is very obvious. We have a categorical variable which has two levels. It's pretty much like a nominal variable with two levels, high fat and high carbs, or high carb. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is the weight, the change in the weight of the participants. So you have to measure this. Like I said, dependent variables have to be measured. You measure this once before the data collection starts, once before the intervention starts, and the second time after the intervention starts, and then you see if there is any significant impact or not. So I already mentioned that you know what dependent and independent variables are, and you know that independent variables cause a variation in your dependent variable. However, you also realize that there are some external variables that could affect your dependent variable, and here I have just come up with an example here to clarify what I mean by that. Extraneous variables could be, faulty scales or lack of interest in the food, because people have to, because you want to measure their weights, and people have to stand on a scale so that their weights could be noted down somewhere, for example, in a document. Vietnamese food. Here is what in clarification of no interest in food. Here is what I have just created a kind of very imaginary scenario, based on my personal experience. I think Vietnamese food is relatively low fat. So Vietnamese participants assigned to the high fat diet might not really like the food because it's very different from the kind of food that they consume on a daily basis. Or you might argue that, well, this explanation is not very precise, because biology research shows that mammals, generally speaking, mammals are more interested in high-fat food, and therefore Vietnamese or any other people from other nationalities would definitely like the high-fat diet. But that's also another explanation, which you could actually provide. But here I'm assuming that the differences between the kind of food that Vietnamese people eat on a daily basis and the high-fat diet that is assigned to them would create a difference there. And as a result of that, they probably eat less because they don't like the food, and they lose more weight. Right? This is just one kind of extraneous variables. And if in reality it happens, what you're looking at is a confounding variable. A confounding variable because people in reality ate little, especially the Vietnamese people ate little, and they lost a higher amount of weight, not necessarily because of the diet type, but because of their food preference or something like that. The food preference is perhaps the main cause of their weight loss, as opposed to high versus high fat versus high carb diet, which we anticipated would affect our participants' weights. So this is a confounding variable which we're not aware of, but we can prevent it. So yeah, this confounding variable can introduce variance in your dependent variable and can create bias. And if this really is proven, if this statement is proven to be correct and applicable to your research, I'm afraid that will be bad news for your investigation, because the results will not be useful, or they will be useless, in other words. Now, we can avoid it. Like I said, we can avoid confounding variables in different ways. The first way to avoid it is to use random assignment. In the first episode, or this section of this video, I explained different types of data collection, and one of the types is random sampling. Actually, random assignment is similar to random sampling, but it happens after sampling, after you have collected a sample. After you collected the sample, you randomly assign half of them to the, for example, high fat group, and another half randomly to the high carbs group. This way you are doing a random assignment. So random assignment is the second level of randomization in your research investigation. How does it work? It actually works pretty effectively by eliminating all confounding variables. The other method is that you could identify potential confounds or extraneous variables and create control variables, so call them covariates. In order to find out if they had an impact on your investigation, you can run ANCOVA or MANCOVA, which I will explain in a separate study, in a separate presentation where I will present a study. So it's important, in order to fulfill this, it's important to know your theoretical frameworks pretty well, and so that you will be able to predict the kind of variables that could affect or confound your outcome. And finally, you can use a counterbalancing methodology where half of each group is assigned to one condition and half to another condition. This is a counterbalancing example here. The high-fat group and high carbs group have 50% of Vietnamese and 50% non-Vietnamese. This is called counterbalancing. One example of counterbalancing. There are other types of counterbalancing as well. Another example which is more closely related to language research is inspired by the kind of research that I've been doing in the past few years on listening comprehension. The terminology that I have come up with is a new terminology is while listening performance and post-listening performance. This I introduced in around 2012, and then 2013. Actually, this is my PhD thesis, and most recently we just finished a research study where we just published the result of an experimental design where we investigated the effects of using different test methods. So I'm going to explain these a little bit so you will be more clear. Imagine that you want to determine the effect of test methods on listening assessment performance. By listening assessment, I specifically mean listening tests in second languages, such as English. I mean, some people learn English as their second language. Well, that's why I refer to it as a second language. So while listening performance tests demand multitasking, they demand that you listen to the listening passage, read the test items at the same time, and answer the test questions. Now, if you're familiar with a test like IELTS, which stands for International English Language Testing System, you would know that it's a while listening performance test. On the other hand, a post-listening performance test is a kind of assessment which does not demand this kind of multitasking. So you're given time to listen to the listening passage. You could take notes, or you could just stay silent and do nothing, just listen. And after that, the questions will be presented to you one at a time, and some amount of time will be given to you to answer the questions. So the simultaneity of listening, reading, and answering in WLPs versus the sequential presentations of the listening passage and questions can create some what we call test method effect. So in this case, the listening assessment and your performance on it, that's your test score, will be the dependent variable, whereas the independent variable is while listening, that's the test methods, which is a two-level variable, while listening versus post-listening performance test. Now, are there any extraneous variables? Like I said, we need to know the theoretical framework of this kind of test pretty well. According to the previous research, which I have actually presented in these studies, some kind of variables could be really intervening here. One is the working memory capacity. For example, some research shows that WLP demands the use of your the storage capacity of your working memory. In other words, it taxes your working memory quite more than PLPs. So if you have a high storage capacity of your working memory, your chances to achieve a high score are higher. So it could be an extraneous variable there. In the same way, good vocabulary knowledge, grammatical knowledge, metacognitive strategies, and so on and so forth, especially reading speed and reading ability, could be extraneous variables. Now you might argue that vocabulary and grammar are actually a part of the listening construct and so on and so forth, which you could be right there. In a separate video, I will discuss this in more details. Then I think clarifications will be made there. But just for the sake of simplicity in this presentation, let's just assume that this scenario actually includes quite a few extraneous variables, such as just definitely number 1 and definitely number 5 and number 6 could be extraneous variables. And the confounding variables could be any of the above if we found that they really exerted a significant influence on the test scores of test takers. That would be bad news for us. Are there any solutions? Yes, I can think of 2 solutions in this scenario. One is to control for the confounding variables by creating covariates and finding out whether the creation of that covariate could alleviate the effect of confounding variables in one way or another. And the second approach will be counterbalancing, which we have explained in more details in this paper. This paper is in press right now, and I think it will come out in a few days. I'll be happy to provide a link to the paper. In any case, I'll provide the full references of the 3 papers in the comments section of this video. Right, now some activity before I close this video today. We can go through these scenarios quickly and find out what is the dependent and independent variables. I'm not going to go through the extraneous and confounding variables because the video is already quite long. For example, the first one is Singapore's government wants to know whether the number of children per family influences the amount of water and electricity that the family consumes on a monthly basis. So immediately see that we have 2 types of variables. Number of children, that's going to be your independent variable, versus the amount of water and electricity which is consumed on a monthly basis, that's going to be your dependent variable. Of course, you can think about other independent, extraneous variables and confounding variables as well. You're interested to know how eating habits of people influence their weight. For example, you can define eating habits as the amount of chocolate that they eat. You can assign people to 2 groups: chocolate eaters and those who are abandoned from eating chocolates for a while. I don't know if you can find anyone who would be interested in that, but certainly there are people who would be a lot of people would be interested to go to the chocolate eaters group. So eating habits would have 2 levels here and would become your independent variable, whereas the weight, the changes in their weight, would be your dependent variable. The third scenario is you want to determine whether the type of feedback influences your students' writing skills. Students' writing skills is your dependent variable, and the type of feedback, for example, teacher feedback versus peer feedback, will be independent variable. You want to investigate the effect of test methods on reading assessments in the same way test methods is independent variable, and reading assessment performance, for example, measured by a test, will be your dependent variable. Number 5 is that you want to determine the effect of anxiety. I have already specified the 3 levels of anxiety: high, mid, and low, on oral presentations. This is a very common observation in many conferences, for example, or even class presentations, and this would be really interesting. Anxiety is our independent variable, and our dependent variable is oral presentations, because you can measure these, the score of people or their performance on oral presentations. You are interested to know how reading speed, high, mid, low, affects L2 learners' reading performance. In the same way, this is the independent variable, and the L2 learners' reading performance is your dependent variable. Now you might argue that, well, we initially mentioned that independent variables are measured, but here obviously anxiety could also be measured, right? True, that's also right, but I'm not going to go into too much details here. What I'm going to here stress is the fact that independent variables in this scenario are supposed to be categorical. That's, they have two or more categories, like high, low, mid, or gender, for example, males versus female, whereas your dependent variables are supposed to have be like a kind of interval scale, or be continuous, like this, like oral presentation scores. So this seventh scenario is that you want to determine whether methods of teaching grammar, that's explicit versus implicit, has an influence on the language proficiency of your students. This is also a very interesting scenario. Your independent variable has two levels, implicit versus explicit, and your dependent variable is the language proficiency of your students. And finally, you are interested to know whether students benefit, for example, learn more from a flipped classroom approach to face-to-face classes. Thanks to the advent of new technologies, now we can use flipped classroom approaches without getting students to come to class. You can teach them. Well, then you can define benefit as learning in statistics or something else. That will become your dependent variable, and your independent variable will be flipped classroom approach versus face-to-face. For example, you can call this mode of instruction. That will be then it will be the dependent variable. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. This brings me to the end of this presentation. If you have any questions or any comments to make, please leave a comment at the bottom of this video. If you like the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Have a good day.